Chapter 15. There, there, son. Mr. Hornby had taken the bull for Matt. You're too young to be having to make sense of this war business. Though, in truth, even an old man such as myself can little understand it. But you are a patriot, right? Matt asked. Nathan Hornby. I'll not have this talk in my house. It's too dangerous. Mrs. Hornby interrupted. Her husband sighed heavily, motioning for Matt to try the stew. Temperance makes a fine stew. He smiled weakly, but a dreadful patriot, I'm afraid. Matt tasted the stew and tried to smile. It's not that she's a Tory, really, Mr. Hornby whispered as his wife went back to her room. It's just that she's afraid. I wouldn't sign for the King's protection papers, as many of my neighbors have. That means our farm is open game for plundering by the British regulars and the Hessians alike, especially if it be known that we were harboring a rebel. He looked down at his gnarled hands and shook his head. I am an old man, and I've worked my whole life for this farm. I've lost most of my fencing to this war. Why, they even cut down two of my apple trees for firewood. My heart is with our American boys, he whispered, but in truth, we're too old to be part of this struggle, and you see, we can't offer you shelter here, for it would be too dangerous. He lifted his weary eyes to Matt. I understand, Matt told him, finishing up the bowl of stew. I had to get back across the river anyway. My sister and friends are probably worried about me. And what is your family's name? Mr. Hornby asked. Carlton, Matt mumbled. My name is Matthew Carlson. So it's Pennsylvania you came from, Matthew Carlson. Mr. Hornby smiled. Forsooth, I've never seen such dress across the river, he said, nodding in the direction of Matt's sweatshirt and jeans, which were hanging in a drying rack behind him. Tell me, what's this contraption on your breeches called? He asked, pointing to the zipper. And the stitching. I've never seen such fine little stitches. Was it your sister who made them for you? Matt could see that Mrs. Hornby had put down her shuttle and was waiting with raised eyebrows for Matt to reply. No, my sister didn't make them. Matt tried to explain. My mother bought. Oh, it was your mother then, Mr. Hornby interrupted. Such a skilled seamstress, he marveled, fingering the top stitching on Matt's jeans. No, you don't Matt began. And your shoe, Matthew, Mr. Hornby exclaimed, picking up the red sneaker. Who made your shoe, and what animal skin is this from? He asked, taking a bite on the rubber sole. Matt looked into the kindly old man's eyes and wondered if he should tell him the truth. He knew a story would be difficult to believe, but Mr. Hornby seemed so willing to listen and so kind. Matt longed to tell someone all that had happened. He took a deep breath and began. I'm not from Pennsylvania. I'm from America, but not your America, Matt said. Oh, I see. You're from the territories, are you? Mr. Hornby asked. Well, yes, I guess Nebraska would be considered the territories, but, well, this is going to sound strange. Matt shot a look at Mrs. Hornby, who was watching him out of the corner of her eye. I'm from the 20th century, he said, looking back to Mr. Hornby. Matt paused, watching the old man's face for a sign of surprise, but Mr. Hornby sat blankly staring. My hearing's a faulting me, lad. What is it you said? He asked, moving closer. The 20th century. I'm from another time, from 20th century America, Matt told him. He explained all about the club and the campout and the rowboat. As Mr. Hornby sat quietly listening, Matt began to hope that he believed his story and that maybe he could even help him find his way back home. Matt watched as the old man looked over to his wife, who now sat on the edge of her stool with her face gone completely sour. Then Mr. Hornby looked back to Matt and softly said, That's all very interesting, Matthew. But tell me, son, did you receive any wound to the head of late? Matt's face fell. You don't believe me, do you? There, Matthew. Mr. Hornby reached out and patted Matt's shoulder. Temperance, I don't think we can let this boy off on his own. He's been affected. That's plain. The old man looked over pleadingly to his wife. Just so, Mrs. Hornby said, standing. But he is more a danger to us now than ever. If he's questioned in our house, there's no relying on what he'll answer. We could lose everything, including our necks. No, he's got to get dressed and leave at once, she said emphatically. Mr. Hornby lowered his eyes. At once, Nathan, do you hear me? At once, she snapped, glaring at her husband as she marched out of the room. She's a kind woman, really. Just frightened, she is. Mr. Hornby sighed. Matt wondered just which one of them he was trying to convince. It wasn't long before Matt had put his clothes back on. They felt warm and toasty after hanging in front of the fire. Mr. Hornby wouldn't let him out of the door without giving him a deerskin coat that the old man claimed he had gotten too heavy for. Come along then, and we'll saddle up Blackjack, Mr. Hornby said, reaching for his hat. Blackjack? Matt asked, following him outside to the barn. My mule, Mr. Hornby lied. He'll follow the trail through the woods and take you right to the river. He's smarter than any horse you've ever been on, I'll wager. Matt watched uneasily as the long-eared, sleepy-looking Blackjack was led from the barn. Matt wanted to tell the old man he had never been on a horse before, much less a mule. A skateboard, Mr. Hornby. That's the last thing I rode on. Matt was thinking as he watched Blackjack open his mouth in a big toothed yawn. You can take care of your business yonder, son, Mr. Hornby told him, nodding toward a little shed behind the house. My business? Matt asked with a blank look. The old man shook his head and sighed heavily. Surely that head wound has left you confused, he said, gently leading Matt to the shed. Come along now. And he opened the door and gave Matt a little push inside. Oh, that business, Matt smiled on discovering that the shed was an outhouse. As he sat on the crude wooden seat, Matt thought of his bathroom at home, with its fancy marble sink and cushioned toilet seat. He looked down at the hard, frozen ground and thought of his bathroom's plush pink wall-to-wall carpet. He sighed, thinking of the jacuzzi that his father had just installed. I never thought I'd admit it, but a bathtub sure would look good about now, he thought, and a roll of toilet paper would look even better. Meanwhile, Mr. Hornby was having a conversation with Blackjack. You're to take him to the river, then, the old man whispered to the mule, and I trust you'll keep to the trail. The lad's a bit daft, you see, so it will be up to you, old boy, to look after him. Matt found the two waiting out on the road in front of the house. He looked warily at the mule and took a step toward him. You've nothing to fear, Mr. Hornby smiled on seeing Matt's worried look. You'll not find a smarter animal, he assured him as he helped Matt climb up on the mule. Now, the first house you come to is just before the river road. It's my cousin's farm, and you can leave him there. Blackjack will know enough to wait for me till I can come and pick him up. You'll have to manage as best you can finding passage across the river. If all goes well this morning, you should be able to return as you came, though in truth it's a miracle you crossed at all with the river being as it is. The old man frowned. I'm sorry that I can't take you as far as the river myself, but my temperess is sick with worry about the troops being so close, and I dare not leave her again. Oh, that's all right, Matt said, as bravely as he could from atop the mule. The day was overcast, and when Matt looked up toward the woods, he could see the threatening storm clouds gathering above the tree line. Just then the door of the house opened, and Temperance Hornby came flying out. Matt felt himself stiffening as he expected some shrill send-off from the old woman. She said nothing, though, as she walked up to Blackjack and offered him a handful of crumbs. Then she brought out her other hand from behind her back, and Matt could see that she was holding a pair of shoes. It's not the season to be without shoes, she said, quietly handing Matt a pair of wool socks and old shoes. She quickly turned and, without another word, hurried back into the house. Thank you, Matt mumbled, embarrassed by her sudden gesture of kindness. Mr. Hornby came up beside him, with his eyes twinkling. Didn't I tell you she had a soft heart? He whispered, untying Matt's sneaker and helping him to unravel the linen rags that he had wrapped on his other foot. The shoes were a little big, but the socks were so heavy that they took up the extra space. They'll be fine, thanks, Matt smiled, looking down at the old buckled shoes. Then he remembered Israel's beads. Mr. Hornby, do you think you can do one more favor for me? Matt asked, reaching into his sweatshirt pocket. Oh, no, he suddenly cried on finding the pocket empty. Here now, what is it, son? The old man asked. The beads. They're gone. My friend's beads. They were in my pocket in a leather bag last night. I have to get them to his sister. I promised Israel I would, Matt cried. Let me have a look in the house, Mr. Hornby suggested. They may have dropped out of your pocket when we hung up your clothes to dry. He went in the house to search for the beads, only to come out empty-handed a few minutes later. I'm afraid they're not there, Matthew, he said, shaking his head. They must have fallen out of your pocket before you arrived. Matt felt profound sadness at having to break his promise to Israel. Unable to hide his disappointment, he thanked Mr. Hornby for looking and for all of his help and kindness. I only wish I could have done more, Mr. Hornby sighed. Don't you think too badly of us, Matthew, he said, pulling Matt's sneaker to his chest. And God be with you. Then he gave the mule a slap on his rump, and the animal headed slowly for the woods. Matt turned around several times to wave goodbye. He was glad that Mr. Hornby had not gone back to the house. It was the same feeling he had when he was in kindergarten, and he wanted his mother to stand in front of the house waving until the school bus pulled away. Only now, instead of a school bus, he was riding away on a mule. He turned around for one last look at the safety of the Hornby farm, and he could just make out the old man standing in his doorway waving with one hand while holding the red sneaker in the other. Matt took a deep breath as he and Blackjack entered the woods. The powerful aroma of pine was everywhere. Matt had never smelled anything so fresh and beautiful. So this is what America was like 200 years ago, he thought, riding past the magnificent evergreens. He felt as if he had entered a fairyland of trees iced with frost. Everything seemed so alive and unspoiled. There weren't any highways with cars or trucks rushing by, no planes overhead, no fast food restaurants or shopping centers. It seemed so strange and different, this America, and yet when he thought about the people he had met, he realized they weren't that different from the people of his own time. He thought of Mrs. Hornby and how she reminded him of his Mrs. Pritchett, his second grade teacher, so much so that Matt wondered if she wasn't Mrs. Pritchett's ancestor. And Mr. Hornby was not unlike Matt's grandfather. Why, even Henry Shutter, now that he thought about it, reminded Matt of the bus guard on his school bus. And Israel, who was Israel like? Matt wondered. He felt the tears coming into his eyes as he thought about his friend. Israel was special, Matt decided, like no one else. He was the older brother Matt had always dreamed of having. Riding along, thinking of Israel, Matt sadly thought about the beads and his broken promise. He rode for a long while, unable to think of anything else. Matt felt ashamed that he had let his friend down. He felt so sad and lonely that he began to talk to Blackjack. Matt told him all about Israel and all they'd been through together. He even told Blackjack about his secret wish to have an older brother, someone just like Israel. Blackjack was very quiet as Matt talked, and every now and then he would turn his head so as not to miss any of Matt's conversation. Blackjack was a very good listener. They were so busy with their discussion that Matt hadn't noticed how far into the woods Blackjack had taken him. Suddenly, a strange noise made the mule jerk his head sharply to the left. Matt heard the noise again, only this time it seemed to be coming from the right. He felt the shiver run through him. It almost sounded like some kind of strange bird call. Did you hear that, Blackjack? Matt whispered nervously. Did that sound like a bird to you? But Blackjack didn't answer as he carefully made his way along the trail, taking them further and further into the darkness of the lush forest. Matt flinched at the sound of another call. Some strange birds in this woods. Huh, Blackjack? He croaked. Or maybe it was a rabbit. My friend Hooter had a rabbit once that got his foot caught in the lawnmower. Kind of sounded like that. But I guess you don't have any lawnmowers around here, do you? Matt whispered. Blackjack wasn't thinking about lawnmowers or rabbits or birds, though. Blackjack, as Mr. Hornby had said, was one smart mule, and he knew what Indians sounded like when he heard them.